Today we are going to talk about the Lumix S1R MarkII, a very convincing camera that can do a lot even cameras costing twice as much can't do. Panasonic invited me and a bunch of other YouTubers to Norway to check out and try the new camera. And I will tell you what I think of the camera. I'm David, you are watching DAVISION in English, and let's go. First of all, this is a pre-production camera that is filming me right now with pre-production firmware, but it is picture ready and I can open RAW files. So for me this is already a complete review, but there are things that can change with firmware until release of the camera. And such a trip to Norway is great, of course, especially if you are passionate about photography and videography. But that doesn't mean that this invitation has influenced my opinion on the camera in any way. If Panasonic had just sent me the camera for testing, I would have also tried to do my best and the most thorough review possible. Now I can add some nice pictures from Norway and memories of a cool time with some friends. But let's get started. The S1R MarkII is for me the most interesting camera introduction in a long time. It even excited me a little bit more than Canon's R5 Mark II last year. Mainly because the S1R MarkII can do some things that Canon's camera can't, but I really appreciate. And that with a price tag of only 3,600 euro. It's much money, but it certainly undercuts the competition in this area. One could even say the S1R MarkII can do more than more as twice expensive Sony A1 Mark II can do. And fortunately the design of the S1R MarkII does not follow the old S1R, but rather the S5 series. The body is very similar to the S5 too, only slightly deeper and equipped with a few new control elements. The camera feels super comfortable in my hands. It's not a block like the old one and it weighs only about 800 grams. According to Panasonic, the camera is dust, splash and cold resistant and can withstand up to -10 degrees. Apart from Nikon's Z8, no other manufacturer states anything about this. We were able to test the weather protection extensively in Tromsø, although we would have preferred to test the freeze protection as well. But the most important thing about the S1R II is certainly the new 44 megapixel sensor without an optical low pass filter. In terms of resolution, this is actually a downgrade from the old S1R, but no one will here complain about this. There were rumors in the meantime that the S1R MarkII would come to the market with a 61 megapixel sensor like Sony's A7R5 or Leica SL3. And I was really relieved that this is not the case. We don't need another camera with this slow and outdated sensor. Instead, we need something that combines resolution, image quality and speed. And the S1R MarkII does this in an unknown way until now. And even if this sounds like a super fast 44 megapixel camera at first glance, the S1R MarkII does not have a stacked sensor. This is a classic and still damn fast BSI sensor, so backside illuminated. Most comparable to the sensor of the Canon R5 from 2020. But with backside illuminated technology. And the S1R MarkII has the base ISO of 80 for photos. It can even be extended to 40 down. All this sounds like pretty good noise performance and dynamic range. Areas where cameras with fast stacked sensors have shown slight disadvantages so far compared to BSI cameras without stacking. In terms of noise performance, the S1R MarkII easily beats my Canon R5 Mark II and my Sony A7R Mark V, and it runs circles around them in terms of noise performance. You can easily go up to 25,600 and even 51,200 still looks very clean compared to the others. Above all, it's color cast free and color noise free, and that's pretty nice. Even in practice, noise was never a problem or unsightly high. In Norway at night, there was no grain to be seen in the pictures. And even in real low light situations, the image remains pleasantly clean. In daylight, it looks no different. You usually use the ISO for faster shutter speeds, like for bird photography. But that wasn't a problem for like every new camera I have had in the recent years. The dynamic range of the sensor looks quite good based on my small studio tests with up to 5 stops of underexposure. Brightening the underexposured image by 5 stops works quite well, and even 6 stops are doable, and the results are comparable to Sony's A7R5 and Canon's R5 Mark II. What the dynamic range in the lab will say will surely be tested soon by someone else. Of course, the sensor of the S1R II is stabilized by IBIS stabilization. So it's an in-body image stabilization system, and this is one of the disciplines where Lumix cameras shine most. On paper, we are talking about 8 stops of IBIS stabilization, an improvement of 3 stops compared to the already quite good S5 Mark II. I could easily take 1 second of handhold exposures to capture what we could see of the northern lights behind the clouds. And what IBIS can do here again, as usual with Lumix, is take pixel shift images with extremely high resolution. You can capture up to 177 megapixel large RAW files this way. And as usual with Lumix, you can do this handheld, with the camera combining the images. With any other full-frame manufacturer, you only do this on a tripod and the pictures are combined later in separate software. How well the stabilization works for video will be discussed later in the video section of this video. A lot of video in one sentence. But what surely interests you is the speed of the camera, because the S1R II can offer quite a bit even without a stacked sensor. At full resolution and RAW format, you can shoot 40 frames per second in SH mode. This is just a short burst mode and not a continuous shooting. Meaning you can shoot this 40 FPS until the buffer is full and then it stops. And the buffer holds 70 images. This means that after 1.75 seconds of holding the shutter, it's over and the camera has to write the files to the card, which doesn't necessarily happen very quickly. But at least it's significantly faster than with the S5 II. However, I personally can't shake the feeling of that this should be faster with CF Express cards. But I also tried it with 4 different ones with no difference at all. Apart from this SH mode, you can now also combine the SH mode with a pre-shooting mode, the SH pre-record mode. You can record up to 1.5 seconds before fully pressing the shutter, but so the buffer is already full when you have pressed the shutter. You can also choose down to 0.5 and 1 second of pre-recording if you desire. Apart from this super fast mode, there are still regular continuous shooting modes that are really continuous, not stopping anyhow when the buffer is full. The H mode offers 8 frames per second and the H plus mode offers 10 frames per second, regardless of the shutter mode. I think there is a noticeable gap between the relatively slow 10 frames per second and the super fast 40 frames per second, which should be filled with electronic 15, 20 or 30 frames per second to avoid reaching the buffer limit so quickly. So the camera can be super fast, faster than my Canon R5 II, faster than a Z8 and even faster than an A1 Mark II, but not for particularly long time. And a disadvantage at this point, since it's not a stacked sensor, the RAW images in SH mode also only have 12-bit of color depth, similar to Canon's R5, R6, R6 II. But this can be overlooked usually. This high dynamic range is not needed for the highest speed images like with birds in flight. Some of you might are interested in how fast the sensor is exactly in its readout time. How fast can it read out? Which is especially important for rolling shutter issues. Without a stacked sensor, you won't reach the times of a Z8, R5 II or A1 II. As much should be clear, but you also pay less for it. The readout time varies depending on the bitrate, with 37 milliseconds for a full 14-bit RAW file that is available in H+ and single images. And this is relatively slow. But a lower resolution Sony a7 IV only manages to have 67 milliseconds, and a higher resolution Sony a7R V around 59 to 100 milliseconds. In this context, the 37 milliseconds are decent to good. But when it comes to 12-bit color depth in H+ or SH mode, we are talking about 20 milliseconds of readout time. This is much better than the 32 milliseconds of a Sony a7 IV or the 50 milliseconds of a Sony a7R V. And as mentioned earlier, a Canon R5 from 2020 is the best comparison in terms of speed, with 17 milliseconds at 12-bit. And this speed of the sensor will not completely eliminate worries about fast pans or fast movements in front of the camera having a rolling shutter. But it is a significant advantage compared to the other non-stacked Sony sensors so far. And so the S1R Mark II is even quite a bit faster despite its significantly higher resolution compared to the S5 Mark II with only 24 megapixels. And thanks to the fast readout times, the S1R Mark II can also handle shorter shutter speeds with an electronic shutter. Mechanically, it's still 1/8,000th of a second, but electronically you can go up to 1/16,000th of a second, making it easier to work with fast lenses in daylight, for example backlit low sun situations. So overall, this sensor offers a quite unique combination of resolution, dynamic range, high ISO performance and speed. And I really like this overall package. Only the somewhat limited continuous shooting due to the buffer speed leaves slightly bitter aftertaste and could be improved. When taking photos of this sea eagle you saw, it was extremely frustrating that the buffer was full and did not ride away quickly enough.
Ich kann nur noch Einzelbilder machen, fuck!
But perhaps Panasonic is still fine-tuning the firmware bit by bit, so in the end it could be better than with my experience. By the way, also pretty cool, after Canon, Sony and Nikon, Lumix also offers the option to close the shutter when turning off the camera to protect the sensor from dust. And by the way, the shutter sound is also not bad. Sounds full and rich and nice without clattering. And what also gives the camera a significant added value on the photo side is the LUMIX LAB App, which we have known since the S9 last year and which has been usable with the S5 Mark II and S5 IIX since autumn. Of course, it works with the S1R MarkII as well, and you can load real-time LUTs onto the camera, meaning you can load image looks from the LUMIX LAB App library onto your camera, like presets or Fujifilm film simulations, for your photos and for your videos. This is a lot of fun to play with, especially for street photography or just family and vacation snapshots, and is much more versatile than Fuji's simulations. Only the LUTs come from the community and not from the manufacturer in this case. And by the way, pro tip, you can not only transfer LUTs to the camera, but also can download them and use them in post-production for your workflow, not just with Lumix material, not just with Lumix cameras. The S1R MarkII, like the S5 II, offers face detection autofocus on this sensor. Since the S5 II, Panasonic has worked a lot on the algorithm behind it. Let's take a quick look at the side-by-side comparison of the S5 II and the S1R MarkII. And we see that both cameras are very similar in terms of autofocus detection and tracking of peoples. I would say the S1R MarkII detects a little bit better than the S5 II, at least when it comes to people. And now you can enjoy Michael's dance a little bit longer. But compared to one of the best, if not the best autofocus on the market from the Canon R5 Mark II, you can see significant differences. The Canon detects head and eyes at much greater distances, where the Lumix only selects the body, and the Canon can better keep up with fast moving subjects. But does it mean that you can forget about the Lumix autofocus? No, not by a long shot. The autofocus is perfectly usable, especially for people in front of the camera in good lighting conditions. Taking portraits or photographing a wedding is no challenge for this autofocus. I would rank the autofocus above the Sony a7 IV in terms of detection and tracking, but I am sure there's still more potential, as the S1R Mark II has significantly more computing power, and I'm excited to see how Panasonic will continue to improve this camera with firmware updates over the years. The accuracy, however, is a different story than the tracking. That's why I took continuous shots and let Michael run towards the camera to see how it performs. And it was really surprisingly good. There was minimal fallout in the continuous shots. So they are pretty usable in these terms. Where the S5R Mark II can do more than the S5 II are the detection targets in autofocus tracking, now including motorcycles, bicycle trains and airplanes. What is unfortunately missing is an automatic switching between tracked subjects that Canon, Nikon and Sony now have. Overall, the Lumix autofocus has significantly been improved since my original review of the S5 II on my German channel 3 years ago. People with hats and glasses are now no problem at all. Neither frontally nor profile, and I would have no hesitation in trusting the S1R Mark II with a portrait shoot or with a wedding. It's on a good path to becoming one of the top 3 for people in front of the lens. In Norway, I also tried photographing some birds from a boat with Sigmas 60 to 600 mm. And the autofocus has had some issues. But that was with a firmware version that has since been updated twice concerning autofocus. Gulls are rather unreliably detected and usually only if they stood out clearly in front of the sky or are really large in front of the frame or filling the frame. But then even with eye detection. The Sea Eagle, on the other hand, was clearly and distinctively detected and tracked due to its clear movements and the nice contrast to the background. I unfortunately have no current better experience with wildlife using the camera and the new firmware, as I only own 2 lenses for myself so far. With this pre-production firmware that we received with the camera, there were also some issues in low light. For example, in this Sami tent here, lit only by fire, but it was a really low light situation, and I also have no comparison as how another camera would have performed in this situation. In terms of autofocus, I still see some room for improvements and optimizations, and especially with the buffer filling so quickly up. It is a camera that can do wildlife and sport, but it's not absolutely optimal for it. But cameras that are optimal for this cost a lot more and sometimes offer significantly less in other areas. And also, one of the big strengths of Lumix cameras are the video features. Here the S1R MarkII can do more than my Canon R5 MarkII or Sony Alpha 1 MarkII can do. There's only one point where I would have wished for a bit more. Otherwise, this camera is a true hybrid monster, doing photos well and doing videos very well. A few key data points: you can record up to 8.1K video with 30 FPS from the entire sensor width. Open gate video with 6.4K up to 30 FPS, downsampled from the whole image. And later, 7.2 and 8.1K open gate video will be supposed to follow via firmware. In plain language, this means you can film open gate and cut a vertical video from this open gate video, and this vertical video will still have 5.4K resolution on the long edge, leaving plenty of crop space to play with. Something even crazier, the camera can read out the entire sensor with a minimal crop at 60 FPS and downsample it to 5.9K 60 or also 4K 60 with downsampling, something only Nikon's Z8 can do among the current fast and high resolution cameras. Neither Canon's R5 MarkII nor Sony's A1 MarkII offers 60 FPS with downsampling from nearly the entire image sensor. And that's something I've been massively missing. And want a little bit more? It also offers 4K 120 FPS. It's not downsampled then, and it has a 10% crop. Either recorded directly with sound or already slowed down as S and Q slow motion. This leaves very few wishes unfulfilled to this point. The only wish I would had is open gate video in combination with a higher frame rate, but I measured it and the sensor unfortunately doesn't allow it. With 60 FPS and 16:9 height, you are just under the necessary 16.6 milliseconds in readout time that would fit for 60 FPS. That would have been the icing on the cake for an otherwise extremely rounded package and a lot of fun for video. But that's not all at all. Internal ProRes recordings are in this camera, up to 5.8K 30 FPS. You can record also ProRes 4:2 HQ in this camera and even internal RAW video. Unfortunately, only ProRes RAW as pixel by pixel crop, like to a Super 35 frame, at 5.7K up to 30 FPS. And in addition to ProRes 4:2, there are also intra-frame and 4:2 video modes up to Cinema 4K, which we already know from these S5 IIX. All resolutions above Cinema 4K are only available with a 4:0 subsampling, presumably for performance reasons, both in the camera and probably also for your PC. Even the 6K 24 from the S5 II is quite demanding for a common PC, and 6.4K or even 8K won't be any easier. But I would have wished for a better subsampling and bitrate here, or at least having more options. What's also pretty cool, the camera features a dynamic range extender for log recordings. What does that mean? According to my measurements, the sensor is then read out with full 14-bit color depth for maximum dynamic range instead of the 12-bit. This makes the sensor slower than the modes I just listed. But according to Panasonic, you can record 14 instead of 13 stops of dynamic range, at least in real-time frame rates. You can see a noticeable jump in the histogram when switching this on. The highlights are no longer clipping. Compared directly to the S5 II, the dynamic range in dynamic range extender mode is slightly lower according to Panasonic, but the S5 II cannot do, for example, record 4K 120 FPS or even 60 FPS downsampled from the whole sensor. And I prefer having this option for higher frame rates in sacrifice of the dynamic range. Of course, best would be both, but you can't have everything and you're not paying what you are paying with other brands. The rolling shutter readout times of this sensor without this dynamic range extender are okay and I would say good. It's 22 milliseconds for widescreen video at 24 FPS to 30 FPS. For 6.4 open gate, we are talking about 28 milliseconds for a 3:2 frame. Not fast, but not bad either. 5.9K 60 or 4K 60 FPS widescreen is readout in 15 milliseconds. As mentioned earlier, fast enough for 16:9 or 17:9, but not for the complete sensor height. It would be too slow for open gate with high frame rates. When the dynamic range extender is enabled, the sensor reads out widescreen video only in about 30 milliseconds. That's slow, and it's slightly slower than the S5 II was. OpenGate 6.4K then only goes up to 25 FPS because the 37 milliseconds not being fast enough for 30 frames per second. Overall, these are quite justifiable results. Not much worse in fast mode than in R5 II, Z8 or A1 II, but with good dynamic range in the DRE mode, but then very slow. And otherwise, the video features are just as diverse as we are used to it from the S5 II. With my biggest love, shutter angle in this camera as well, a waveform display on board, anamorphic desqueezing, anamorphic stabilization for a perfect anamorphic workflow thanks to this OpenGate recordings. However, new to the S1R MarkII is a false color display for exposure checks, and the video autofocus is at a usual Lumix level. After the S5 II finally had face detection autofocus, there's basically not much to complain about the video autofocus. I already filmed 2 complete videos for my German channel with the S1R MarkII and the DJI RS4 mini review here on the channel also. In the studio setup with controlled lighting conditions, the autofocus with the latest firmware did exactly what it was supposed to do and was absolutely reliable for talking head. Also pretty reliable for B-roll and also for overhead shots. Even in Norway during the Tromsø log recordings, there were hardly any problems with the autofocus. But we noticed that there's no subject detection available at 4K 120 FPS, but it is available up to 60 FPS at least if you don't have an HDMI output connected. Vlog in this camera still gives me a lot of joy during editing and cutting. For me, it's one of the best log formats and the easiest to work with in grading and still offers plenty of room in every direction. And there's also a new Cine-like A2 that I'm filming right now in, and this should mimic the ARRI colors. And what we have new in this camera, it's the first full frame camera with 32-bit float audio recording via Panasonic's XLR2 adapter, what I'm using right now. It's a really great thing. I used it for the videos I recorded with this camera, and recording audio without clipping fear is really, really great. Unfortunately, I had some grounding problems. For example, as soon as I connected my HDMI monitor and it was powered by mains, there were background noises that I don't have with a similar setup with my Canon R5 II and the Tascam XLR module. So I need to look into this a little bit more. But such an S1R MarkII with the XLR2 adapter and the 35mm prime lens in front of it, that could become the optimal studio video setup for me. And due to the lower base ISO of the sensor, filming in log is even more fun here. With Vlog without dynamic range extension, the lower base ISO is just 200, which means in this Tromsø log experience weather that we had, no one of us needed an ND filter for filming anything. The second base ISO is 1000 in this mode, and when dynamic range extender is enabled, the lower base ISO is 400 and the upper base ISO is 2000. The S5 MarkII had 640 and 2500, so a stop higher. And I'm slowly getting that feeling that Panasonic can never be overtaken or surpassed by anyone in terms of video stabilization. There must be some black magic behind the fact that Lumix video stabilization works just so well. You can shoot smooth video handheld even while walking with a Lumix, what you could not do with any other. And even without any additional crops in this Lumix camera, and I still just love it. Moreover, the S1R MarkII also has a fan from the S5 II on board to actively counteract overheating. In my tests, there were no overheating problems in real-time frame rates up to 30 FPS. Everything ran until the battery was empty in a 22-degree room temperature environment. Only with 5.9K and 4K 60 FPS from the entire sensor in the high temperature mode and with fan mode 2, overheating occurred after 40 minutes. So if you film continuously for 40 minutes in HFR at 6K or 4K, it will be too much for the S1R MarkII. But everything else runs fine. Even 4K 120 ran until the battery eventually ran out of juice and without shutting off the camera beforehand. And you can't say that about any other camera in this context here. Additionally, there's finally a tele light on the front of a Lumix. Not just in the front, but also in the back. So you always know if the recording is running. We love it. And what I also find really great is the new LUMIX LAB app, which makes it much easier to connect an iPhone or an Android device via USB-C cable to use as an external monitor for your S1R MarkII. The functionality as a monitor is still quite rudimentary. For example, there's no lock display assist, and you can just change the basic exposure settings, but I'm optimistic that there will be more improvements over time to this app. I've heard the app is supposed to be expanded to a wireless connection as well, and we will see how it works then with the low lag that it has over USB-C. You can also save a shot list and make storybook templates for scenic projects in this app. And that's it for now on the subject of video. The S1R MarkII is a real hybrid monster and offers a lot that simply are foreign words to others. 60 FPS from nearly the entire sensor with downsampling. Sony? Canon? Where? Open gate or even anamorphic de-squeezing and an active cooling fan in an overall cheaper package. That's something that the competition needs to beat soon. But let's talk about a few externals of the camera. I've already said that it remains the form factor of the S5 II, which I think is super cool. I was a bit scared that the S1R MarkII would have been as big as the S1R or S1H. The camera is slightly deeper than the S5 II, and so there's room for a really great display mechanism, like we've first seen in the S1H or later in Sony's A7R5, which means you can tilt both up and down in the optical axis and also pull the display away from the camera. But you can also flip the display out sideways for portrait shots or forward selfies or overhead shots. So you get the best of all worlds, and because you can move the display away from the body, there are also no problems with connected HDMI cables when you flip the display sideways. I would almost say it's perfect, but unfortunately the display is only 3 inches large, so even smaller than the first S1R. The competition installs 3.2-inch screens. That's a bit of a shame, but it wasn't a deal breaker for me. The display is quite high resolution for a 3-inch screen with 1.84 million dots, and the difference in sharpness and brightness compared to the S5 II is noticeable at first glance. It's also quite nice that the viewfinder is disabled when you tilt the display, but unfortunately not when you just flip it out. And Panasonic remains the only manufacturer with automatic display brightness mode. But in the end, the flap out mechanism convinced me the most. There was hardly any case I completely flipped out the display, at least not for landscape format shots. However, the viewfinder of this camera has also been significantly improved over the S5 MarkII. Yeah, but it remains the same in terms of specs to the S1R, which was ahead of its time with 5.76 million dots in the viewfinder. It is pride its high resolution, and it apparently can deliver this high resolution at 120 Hz. That's good. The magnification could be better, but overall you are on a level with the Canon R5 Mark II, but without the eye control AF on the new camera here. For me, a real annoyance with the S5 Mark II was the use of SD cards. I use the camera for a lot of video, and copying large video files or many photos from an SD card is something I am far too impatient for nowadays. Even the 300 MB per second for a fast UHS-2 card are a horror for that. So I am so pleased that there is now a camera the size of the S5 II that can also handle CF Express cards. The S1R MarkII accepts SD UHS-2 in one slot and CF Express Type B in the other. That are the right ones, the big ones, the fast ones, and the ones everyone uses who isn't Sony. With such a fast card in the camera and with a fast system of reader and SSD, even really large files are copied in just a few seconds. A cheap Angelbird card reads out 6 times faster than a UHS-2 SD card, and a CF Express Type 4 card 10 times faster than UHS-2 SD. In the camera itself, many video formats can only be recorded with CF Express cards because the data rate would be too high. With ProRes RAW HQ, it can be over 400 megabytes per second. But if CF Express cards are still too expensive for you, you can also record on SSDs with the S1R MarkII, just like the S5 IIX could. Lumixes are still the only cameras that offer this option, and I think it's great. The small Lexa I showed you for the iPhone could be plugged in directly to the USB-C port or moved somewhere else with a small extension cable. However, you have to make sure that the SSDs used are fast enough for what you are shooting, and the SSDs need to be one-time formatted in the camera to be used. With higher quality options, the camera unfortunately asks for more power when trying to record to an SSD, so you have to use a DC coupler or something like that. And there are also all the ports you would expect from a modern camera. A large HDMI at the bottom, which is more practical when you flip out the display. Unfortunately, only one USB-C, but it can also charge, yes, and connect SSDs like no one else. And ports for microphone and headphone now finally all have their own cover, so that not all ports are exposed just because you want to use one. Lumix thinks ahead. There's a 2.5mm remote port on the other side of the camera, and the HDMI port is an HDMI 2.1 spec that can also output 8K video or 4K 120 FPS. And it's also supposed to be able to output RAW video to Ninja or Blackmagic recorders via firmware update soon. So I'm super excited about having B-RAW from that camera. That would be pretty nice. In terms of operation, you can basically say that Lumix combines the best of both worlds. You have the buttons on the top for ISO, white balance and exposure compensation, like with a Nikon camera. And also 3 full control dials that can be used separately for aperture, shutter and ISO. And in addition, the rear dial is, unlike with Canon, also a control cross. I really like the handling and the button placement, and I would say the operation is not a problem for Sony, Nikon or Canon users after 2 days, but the menu system can be quite overwhelming when you're first new to Lumix. The power switch has been changed. There's also now whopping 5 custom profiles on the mode dial. C5 can be host 3 profiles, so 7 custom profiles that can be quickly accessible. In addition, there's now finally a separate photo and video switch and S&Q switch on a Lumix, so that you can have all your modes, all your custom slots, both for photo and for video. I love it. And with the S&Q switch, you quickly get to slow motion functions like 4K 120 FPS. It is hard to do it much better than here. The dials now have lock switches if you don't want them to be turned accidentally. And there's a new custom button on the front of the camera, which is red, which is standardly intended for video recording when you are in front of the camera. But as always, with a Lumix, you can assign almost any function of the camera to perform by any button of the camera on your own. So make it your own. But let's talk about battery life. Not exactly the prime discipline of the S5 MarkII or older Lumix cameras. And the S1R MarkII doesn't do much better here either. CPAR values aren't that valuable, but maybe hold some value for comparison. Panasonic's statement was that they should be similar to the S5 MarkII. That's good in itself because there's so much more in it. Much more computing power, much more resolution on the sensor, display and viewfinder, and CF Express cards also draw more power. So the camera is more efficient at all, but it's not better. Or better to say, it's the worst out of the similar cameras I did take into consideration for my graph here. For video it's similar, unfortunately. The S5 II in my tests achieved 105 minutes. back when I tested it in 6K open gate or 6K widescreen. With 4K 60 in crop mode it came down to 85 minutes. With the S1R MarkII I get 70 to 75 minutes depending on the recording mode. But it doesn't matter if you have 8.1K 24 widescreen, 6.2K open gate, 5.9K 60 or even 4K 120. The battery always ran out of juice after 70 to 75 minutes, which is not super convincing but not surprising for a fast camera that can do all of this. For example, the Canon R5 Mark II achieves similar times but does not offer downsampling 5.9 or 4K 60 FPS. However, I noticed that Panasonic batteries gave up much faster in the cold. Outside at 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, a battery was shown as empty that still had 2 bars when I came back to the hotel room. Maybe this introduction of new batteries as Canon did is not a bad idea in every case. So let's come to a conclusion. I had this camera for more than 2 weeks and did a lot with it during that time. I had much more fun than frustration with the camera. I found the package really well rounded and the performance is also great. It's a very convincing all-around camera, so to speak. The jack of all trades that has hardly existed in this price range so far. My Canon R5 Mark II can't do everything that the S1R Mark II can, but it does a bit more in other areas. But it also costs much more. A Nikon Z8 has been on offer at a similar price point, but it's something else in terms of size and weight, and can also do a little bit more than the S5R Mark II in some respects and less in others. For landscapes, I see no restriction with the S1R Mark II, even probably advantages because of the not stacked sensor. For people photography, I see no hindrances either. It's very convincing all around and the autofocus works well for people. Where I see room for improvements is in wildlife or sports, where the autofocus needs to be more reliable. And it would be great to have burst rates between the rather slow 10 frames per second and the very fast 40 frames per second, especially given this limited buffer time. For video, I see hardly any room for improvements. 8K video, soon to be even open gate. 60 FPS from nearly the entire sensor with downsampling. Neither my R5 Mark II nor the A1 II can do this, and this costs twice as much. 4K 120 FPS has never been available in this price range below 4,000 euro in a hybrid camera. Rolling shutter without DRE is pretty good at that price, and even if others tell you it's not. In addition, video shooting with Panasonic is simply much more fun and less frustrating thanks to all of the features, the aids, the possibilities, the cooling than with all the other brands. In the end, the question remains, who could this be the right camera for? And I can clearly say it would be the right camera for me. This would be exactly the right thing for me if I weren't stuck in the Canon ecosystem. A photo and video hybrid monster that leaves few wishes to be unfulfilled on both sides. The S1R Mark II has left a lasting impression on me and will almost certainly ensure that my collection of L-mount lenses will grow over the next months. After all, the L-mount has the second largest selection of lenses on the market, quite after Sony's E-mount. Even through something like a 16 to 35 2.8 is still missing for my happiness. But feel free to tell me what you think of the Lumix S1R Mark II. Write it down in the comments under the video. If you think you belong to the target group of the S1R Mark II and the camera is something for you, you will find links to the camera under the video in the video description. And if you buy through these links, you support this channel for free to you and ensure that I can continue making such videos for you. If you're still watching at this point, respect for your perseverance. And if you liked it, feel free to leave a like under the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and press the bell if you don't want to miss any future videos from me. Here are 2 more videos that you can watch right now, because that's it for today, and I would say see you next time.